All right, my name is Kellia Kaneze, and I'm the first affirmative speaker of the side, should hate speech be banned. Now, hate speech is a speech that attacks a person or a group of people on the basis of attributes such as race, ethnicity, gender, or religious affiliation, with the intent to cause or incite violence to a group of people. In the past, hate speeches have been used as a way of spreading hate ideologies among populations, which made it easy for mass atrocities to occur. We are fully aware that the opposition may step out here and argue that banning hate speech would be equal to banning freedom of speech, but we will show you that freedom of speech is not absolutely free itself. The First Amendment of the United States protects freedom of speech, but it does not protect any speech that incites harm to others. And for this case, we, as the proposition side today, are considering hate speech as any speech that incites violence against a group of people, not any speech that may sound offensive, insulting, or critical. According to an article published by the FBI, out of 6,121 criminal incidents reported, 6,063 were single bias incidents. Of the single bias incidents reported, 57.5% were motivated by a race or ancestry bias. 21% were motivated by a religious bias, and 17% were motivated by sexual orientation. Our goal tonight is to reduce this number because it is ridiculously large. I'll go on with the first reason as to why we think hate speech should be banned. Our first argument is that hate speech should be banned because hate speech dehumanizes the victim group. As mentioned earlier, hate speech incites violence against a group of people. Hate speech achieves this through dehumanizing the victim group. Now, dehumanization is the fourth stage of the genocide, according to Gregory Stanton. This is a process where the victim group's humanity is taken away from them. Dehumanization usually comes along with equating the victims' groups to diseases, animals, or any other thing that is less than humans. In Rwanda, the masterminds of the 1994 genocide against the Tutsis used hate speech as a way to dehumanize the targeted group, which were the Tutsis. They publicly called out Tutsis and they called them cockroaches and snakes, and therefore they needed to be exterminated because they could harm anyone. Leaders used dehumanization through hate speech as a way to legitimize their actions towards the victim group. Hate speech encouraged perpetrators to feel less guilty for their actions, since violence to a subclass of humans was not a crime, but rather a favor to the world. We believe that dehumanization indicates that a nation is halfway through the genocide. In order to avoid upcoming mass killings and violence, we need to ban hate speech that dehumanizes a certain group of people because of what they are. We need to reduce the psychological effect caused by hate speech, which makes it easy for violence to occur. And we need to ban hate speech that takes away humanity from a certain group of people. But most importantly, we need to ban speeches that could generate another atrocity like a genocide. Second of all, hate speech psychologically prepares people for mass violence. In cases of mass violence, hate speech is commonly used to propagate violent ideologies. Leaders use hate speech as a way to lay ground for their actions. They start off by creating a polarization between groups, and they divide the nation into a we and a them. But they also create a thing whereby the two groups are so different that they cannot interact. Then they dehumanize the victim group by calling them names unworthy of humans, which makes it easy for them to discriminate them against some of their rights, like education, food, shelter, important positions in the government, etc. Due to hate speech, any discrimination against the targeted group becomes legitimate. I'll still take Rwanda as an example. In Rwanda, there were certain policies that were put in place to limit Tutsis from accessing education. A certain quota system stated that only 14% of the student population should be Tutsis, and the rest could be Hutus. In a normal situation, people would have simply questioned why this has to be done. But for the case of Rwanda, nobody stood up against that quota system simply because they believed that the population of Tutsis were animals and therefore did not deserve education. Hitler used the same method of hate speech against Jews by calling them names, by calling them dogs and inciting violence to them. He used hate speech as a way to prepare people psychologically for any violent actions, which made it that nobody felt guilty for killing Jews since they were dogs, and nobody felt guilty for discriminating them. Hate speech is a gradual process, and the more it is propagated, the more it affects people and makes it easy for violence to be carried out. And my third point, which my second speaker is going to elaborate more, is that hate speech leaves no room for convicted civility. Hate speech usually targets one group, dehumanizes it, and discriminates it. Now, hate speech creates tensions between the perpetrator and the victims because it gives them an idea that they're so different that they cannot engage in one another. Due to the great extent of polarization, the two groups do not even try to talk to each other, which becomes hard to prevent violence. And at this point, because we already have two groups that are deeply separated. Hate speech does not promote convicted civility because people are too convicted that the other is too different to even think of trying to engage one another. We need to ban hate speech to promote the spirit of convicted civility because it's only through convicted civility that we will learn that it's okay to be different, but then we should not kill each other or incite violence to one another because we are different. Thank you.
Starting up. Once again, I'd like to thank everybody for being here, my partner, the audience. I hope we have a wonderful debate today. We have a pretty good resolution. And the resolution, again, today is, hate speech should be banned? And as the negative, I'm going to say no. Now, to begin, I'd like to reference a quotation from the great philosopher Voltaire, who once said, "I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." Now, I believe this speaks to the crux of what we're talking about today, essentially your freedom of speech. As my opponents point out, they provide their own definition of what they believe to be hate speech, and so as the negative, I will also provide one. Hate speech, as the negative defines it, is simply speech expressing hatred of a particular group or people. Now, obviously, we have two very differing definitions of what hate speech is, and this speaks to my first contention perfectly, which is the contention of ambiguity. Now, a Cato Institute research poll as of 2017 reports that 82% of Americans agree that hate speech should be banned, but disagree on what hate speech is. What this points to is the ambiguity around what should be banned or what should be restricted, and this is exactly what we'll be discussing today as the negative. Far beyond being just an abstract thought, we can actually look to countries that have already begun to ban hate speech or implement policies such as the affirmative has presented. Specifically, in an article published by Bloomberg on March 26th of 2018, they report that France, who has published the defamation law, has recently become subject to varying acts of, let's say, subservience. In this article, they specifically talk about the collateral damage to speech that should be protected, and yes, this includes speech that may be distasteful to you or another. In the article, they go on to say that this law has been used to not only to frequently by the powerful to bludgeon legitimate investigations. What I mean by this is that if we categorize hate speech broadly without a concrete definition, what we end up doing is categorizing everything that we disagree with as hate speech. This includes criticism of the government done by independent bodies. And this brings me to my second point within this contention, that freedom of speech and the ability for anyone to freely express themselves is key to well-functioning democracy. In an article published by Express Tribune on May 7th of 2018, they specifically allude to this idea that when you have a functioning democracy, you allow everybody to criticize the government openly. And once we have this, once we start chipping away at what is or what is not protected constitutionally in terms of freedom of speech, we go down this slippery road until finally we end up with a shadow of what we used to be. My opponents talk a lot about genocide and hate crimes and the violence government take against individuals, but we have to realize that this only occurs when governments are not challenged by the people, and this is exactly what we sacrifice when we begin to challenge what people can or cannot say. Now, going on to my second point, when my opponents specifically talk about hate speech, they bring up a lot of very harsh and drastic examples of when hate speech has been used to justify violence against what I'm going to term as the other, basically anyone that's different from you or a group of people you might look to subjugate. But what they fail to realize is that hate speech as a whole is more of a band-aid solution to a very complex issue. Specifically, if we look towards the US, we realize that we see that in 1996, the Supreme Court has already ruled against hate speech that would incite violence or propose any imminent danger to an individual. This has already been banned in the US, but what we see is no less harm done to people or discriminated classes within the US. Charlottesville is an example of where, yes, these laws do exist, but unless we tackle the root issue, which is a person's individual prejudice, this issue will not be solved. The ultimate point here is that laws don't change individuals. Individuals have to change individuals. We change each other, laws don't. We influence what law is, not the other way around. And so we see is this world presented by the affirmative. There are problems right now, but this cannot be simply solved with a band-aid solution of keeping people from saying hate speech. What we have to do is take a deeper look at the faults in our society before we begin to make policies that will only send us backwards. In the world of affirmative, there are problems, but they are being addressed in different ways. But in the world of the negative, once you ban hate speech, you go down this slippery road which only erodes our freedom of speech, and we have much worse outcomes. Genocides like the ones we see in Rwanda and other countries such as Nazi Germany will only become more prevalent the more you limit a person's ability to openly question the government or openly express what they feel, whether or not you disagree with that or not. At the end of the day, what is the cost of protecting someone from speech? It is democracy. Thank you.
Very nice. Ready. Opponents ready? Okay. So first I'd like to start off by thanking our opponents for being here, the audience, and more obvious, the Rwandans for being here. First, I'm going to go ahead and start by touching base on case, which is going to be more emphasizing our case. Then I'll go ahead and counteract the arguments presented by the off case. So first, what we want to do is create laws and policies that discourage bad behavior, but do not punish bad beliefs. I know that that our opponents definitely said, well, you're going to prevent people from expressing their own behavior. And we want to punish for the content of the message itself. Per Impactor 2016, and this was reported by one of a chief of the detectives, he reported an incident of bias crimes that increased by 115% between election and early December 2016. And why is that? It's because of the racism that our president themselves is bringing here. They went ahead and reported an incident of a Muslim transport worker who was called a terrorist right before being pushed down a flight of stairs. So like our opponents are saying is, well, he might have been hurt by that term, but oh well, take it, because that's my freedom of speech. While this individual is now scarred, not only by the incident, but by the way that he's been signaled as a Muslim. Hate speech is something that society must take seriously and not dismiss, just like our opponents are trying to do. It's something that might at worst just hurt someone's feelings of an oversensitive person, but there's evidence that hate speech predicts violence, that groups more exposed to hate speech are more likely to commit suicide, and it causes dehumanization effect, just like my partner went ahead and explained during her speech. Inflammatory speech rises steadily before outbreaks of mass violence, which again was presented by my partner when she presented the Holocaust example and also the Rwandan example. It suggests that it is a prerequisite for violence. It makes sense. It makes sense, right? Groups of killers do not form spontaneously out of speech. Jews were called rats and venom by Nazis right before the Holocaust, again explained by my partner. Tutsis were called cockroaches by the Hutu before the horrendous 1994 Rwandan genocide. Moving forward, our goal is to create laws and policies that discourage bad behavior but do not punish bad beliefs. We have seen an increase in spikes in hate crime statistics and incidents of hateful speech over the last year that suggests a problem spiraling out of control. Do you want to see a world where we end up like the Holocaust and then try and take action once the Holocaust has occurred? Or do you want to take action now before we let that happen? It's unethical to choose to protect free expression of speech, just like our opponents are asking for, over the hurt, or even worse, over the harm of an individual. According to the FBI.gov, and these are results of 2016, and this was reported by my partner as well, out of 6,121 criminal incidents, 6,063 were single bias incidents. 57.5% were caused by race, ethnicity, and ancestry bias, 21% by religion, 17.7% by sexual orientation, and the remainder, it was caused by gender, disability, or gender bias. I'd like to go ahead and close off today's speech by offering a little bit more examples. For example, the 1969 Supreme Court that protected the KK members' hateful and disparaging speech towards African Americans. The 1978 Supreme Court allowed a group of neo-Nazis to march on streets of an Illinois suburb housing Jewish population that included Holocaust survivors. And a more recent example of 2011 that you may have heard of. A father of a military veteran, he lost a lawsuit. Why? Because he was trying to sue after church members stood outside his son's funeral with signs like "God hates," a derogatory word that you may already imagine what it says. Thank God for dead soldiers. So imagine mourning the loss of a son while people are picketing, and this picketing is protected by free speech, and you can't do anything about it. You try and take it to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court denies your case because they say that in their defense, picketing addresses public issues, and that's it. So with this being said, I'd like to go ahead and close it off with one last example, and this was reported by Advocate September 2017. And this is in the words of a man who identifies himself as a gay American. He quotes, "The men who shot me were never caught. Today my body carries scars that will forever remind me of my ordeal and how much work we have to do as a country when it comes to hate and violence. No person should have to fear being violently attacked because of who they are and what they believe they worship." And that's a world that you're going to see living day by day. Being gay, being a Muslim, you live in a world of terror, in the world that our opponents are trying to build. They want to leave things as is, and it is quite evident that leaving things as is not going to fix anything, and as shown in history, will only get worse. Thank you.
Very much, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very happy to be here and excited to be debating about this motion. Now, the main question of the debate that we were all asking that also came from the proposition, which is the affirmative of this debate, is that when people talk about hateful things, it can, after all, lead them to do hateful actions. But there is no direct link between actions that someone takes and actual words that they speak. Because in Rwanda, not everyone who killed was always on radio telling people about killing or telling people about the bad side of the Tutsi. Now, this one is a question again of whereby instead of stopping someone from speaking what's in their mind, can we actually focus on how can we change the mentality of the person? Because stopping someone from saying what they think does not prove that they no longer have the idea that they have. Because if you stop me from saying what I want to say, it does not give you assurance that if I get other prerequisites, because what they said is that for genocide to happen, there is hate speech is kind of a prerequisite. But there are other things that need to be in place for me to kill someone. So if there are other proper prerequisites that needed to be there, there is no guarantee that stopping me from saying that Tutsis are bad, black people are bad, Muslims are bad, that if I have other needed things that need to be in place, that I will not stand up and do a bad thing. So the question now remains that the affirmative of this motion is kind of confusing the two things, the words that I say and the actions that I take. My words might be one of the conditions that need to happen for me to take an action. But my action, if there are other things that are available in place, I might still stand up and take an action, no matter how many times you stop me from saying my idea. Because an idea is on my heart, but not on the words that I just say. Maybe even if you limit what people say, still they're going to stop saying it to make the government that is in power happy, or they're scared to go in jail. But if another government that gives them what needs to be in place, those people can still stand up and take action. That's what happened in Rwanda. I'll give you time. What happened in Rwanda, I love the fact that the first affirmative talked about it. They said that hate speech, they said that hate speech was used to prepare the people to kill other people. But it doesn't mean that we didn't have people in Rwanda who could stand up and oppose the government, but it's because the government said by that time that if you oppose what the government is doing, or if you try to oppose the policies that are in place, it means that you are a hater of the government because your idea makes the government so uncomfortable, or your idea opposes what the government has. Now, it means that since we cannot even define exactly what hate speech is, who is the right person to define hate speech? And then if you were to give the government, which is inciting hate, the right now to define hate speech, then there is no guarantee that the government can still change its mind. Then the argument they're making is non-uniqueness. Either in the presence of hate speech or in the absence of hate speech, people who want to take action will still take action because the idea is the mentality, not just the words that people decide to bring out. Now, another thing is, you had a question?
Yes. So are we saying that because we can't stop everybody, it's not worth stopping that little, that few?
No, that's not what we're saying. We're not saying that because we can't stop everybody, because we have seen incidences where people have been stopped to do very many things in a big number. What I'm saying that stopping everybody does not give you a guarantee that they don't think of hate. Because the ultimate goal that when we asked what's your ultimate goal by banning hate speech, you say that you want to reduce mass violence, you want to reduce all these things that come after violence when people have committed violence. Now, what we are showing you is that banning hate speech does not prove that people cannot engage in violence if they're given other opportunities that need to happen. You mentioned one step or one process that leads to mass violence out of 10. So it means that if a person has the 9 that is remaining minus the 1 that you're saying that we should limit, it means that that person can still do what they are capable of doing because you have not changed the mentality. What the world needs, what we need as a society, is to build a society that makes people believe that your idea is not where the earth or where the universe revolves around. There are other people who think differently. There are other people who think what you don't think about. So by promoting this kind of engagements, allow people to speak out their mind so that at least you know where to start by changing their mentality. That also is the point, because if you limit what people have to say, you don't know where to start by fighting the issue. Now, if you limit what people have to say, it means that you're just going to assume that we are living in a perfect society where nobody hates the other. But then the question remains that, have you changed the mentality of the person? Because for me to say something, it has to come from somewhere. Now, our main point here of the debate is, what is the cost of banning hate speech on the society? Think about it today. Donald Trump is in the position whereby he tweets something and we are all in his comments sliding down, telling him that what you're tweeting is not right, because we have the right to say whatever we want, no matter how bad it looks on the side of the government. Now think of a world whereby you're giving Donald Trump the right to decide what is hate speech or what is right speech. Now it means that we are just going to be in a world whereby people just have to accept words from the public as long as it makes them stay in power, as long as it makes them feel comfortable to be in power. In Nigeria, hate speech is defined as any word that is just going against the government. And we cannot stop them from saying that's the right definition of hate speech, because our affirmative even today has not been able to provide us with the right definition of hate speech. Now, the right thing to do in a society today is to make sure that we build a society that allows tells people to change their mentality, but not to keep quiet and still keep the same heart, still keep the same mentality as they had before they speak the word. Yes?
Well, you talked about how it's lied and correct about Donald Trump's policies, and you talked about how they're bad. But does that change anything with the policies that
That's still the same thing, because the question you're asking to me still works on you. Then if you still allow me not to comment there, then what shows that it's going to change something? Thank you very much.
Again, I'd like to thank everybody for being here. We had a great debate, and hopefully I can finally highlight some of the important issues we talked about today. Now, as my partner mentioned before, the idea comes to this theory that issues are more complex than they appear to be on the surface. Specifically, when my opponents talk about the issues of the Holocaust or Nigeria, as my partner mentioned before, there had to be certain issues in place in order to get to the point of genocide, in order to get to the point of mass violence. We cannot simply ignore the fact that Rwanda as a country before this mass violence was unstable, or the fact that Germany had been taxed into oblivion due to the previous war. These issues are in place long before hate speech is even a component of this mass violence. Again, we have to consider what the cost of hate speech is. And what the cost of hate speech is your ability to challenge the government on certain issues. If the people cannot challenge the government, they have more leeway in order to actually commit acts of violence against their people. Ultimately, yes, the idea of banning hate speech is abstractly good, but rather than take a step backwards, it's more important to analyze, take a step back, and realize that this issue is complex. Analyze it from all facets. Then take a step that you might fumble on. And this is exactly what the affirmative is saying. They're saying we have to do something, and yes, something has to be done, but what they're proposing will actually take us 2 steps backwards. Rather than abruptly charging headfirst at the first idea we come up with, we need to analyze the situation and realize it's more complex than the surface leads us to believe. Thank you.
For being here today. So what I'd just like to go ahead and emphasize is what the NEG is asking you to do today. The NEG is asking you to do nothing about all the violence that is currently happening due to hate speech. And although they say that that we need to take a step back, and that what is this going to really do if a person is going to act upon their actions, whether they want to or not. Think about a world where you can shoot a gun, you can shoot the person you hate, and nothing is going to happen to you because that's your freedom. Now think about the world that we live in today, where there are consequences for the things you do. Yeah, there's people that are still committing the violence out there, but is it reducing it compared to a world where we wouldn't have laws that go ahead and prohibit these things? That causes you to more likely shoot the person that you hate, because you know that there are the consequences. No, we will never live in a perfect world, and asking people to fix themselves, that obviously has not worked. Asking people to fix themselves would have fixed the issue when we had speakers like Martin Luther King speak up. Did that change the world completely? No, it's laws that actually change people. Like we said, it's unethical to choose to protect the freedom of speech over the hurt or even the harm of individuals. What the negative is asking you to do is, I prefer my freedom of speech over you being hurt for being called the N-word. A plan like the negatives is a plan that tells people that they must live with hate speech except under very limited circumstances. A world where it's not okay to yell fire in a theater, but it's okay to yell the N-word at a person of color.